Hey guys, so today's notes are over the diversity of life. This will be brief, but there are a couple things that we want to go ahead and add to what we talked about last class before we start talking about trying to define life. When we start looking at what life is, there are common terms that we see a lot. The first of those is what's called biodiversity. And so these are your essential questions that we want to try and answer by the time we finish today's notes. So what is biodiversity? Okay, bio we talked about last class being the prefix for life. And so what is diversity? Most of you have known that term for a while. Put the two together and what does that exactly mean for biology? Number two, what are the major differences between eukaryotic and prokaryotic cells? Okay, we introduced this last class, but really kind of breezed over it, didn't spend a lot of time on it. Let's try and go a little bit deeper today and see what that gives us. And then number three, what percentage of all life have we currently discovered and why? Let's look at some numbers, or at least percentages, and get an idea of what we know about, what's here, what's gone, and what we're thinking about in terms of what our planet hosts. Okay, let's pause here if you need more time for those essential questions. Otherwise, let's go ahead and get started.
How diverse is life? How many species are there? How varied is life? This is a quality that naturalists refer to as biodiversity. Life exists in a thin sphere around the surface of the Earth. This is called the biosphere. You can think of it as a bit like the skin on a balloon. It probably goes up a mile or two where you can find migrating birds quite high up, and you can also find drifting bacteria. It may go down a mile or two as well, where you find organisms deep in the oceans and even in crevices in rocks. But how many species are there? The truth is, we don't really know, but we know there are a lot. The first modern attempt to count and classify species was that of the Swedish naturalist Linnaeus, who published a famous work in 1735 in which he estimated there might be about 4,000 species, but these were mostly large species. By the late 19th century, naturalists estimated that there had to be at least 500,000 species, and by 2011, most biologists would say there were perhaps 9 million different species, and some were saying that there might be up to 100 million. And that's not counting bacteria, which change so fast, so we can't really count them. But only about 1 million of these have actually been classified and named and defined. So how do you count them? There are lots of methods. Some are just very painstaking. You take an area and you go through it slowly with a magnifying glass and you count. But one method that ecologists use is using mist nets. These are nets with very fine meshes, and you throw them over an area of rainforest or grassland, and you spray everything inside it, and you stun them, and you go and you just count. And when they do this, almost invariably they'll find within just a few square meters they can count 1,000 or more species, and almost invariably too, there'll be a few that have never been seen before, never named, never classified. So if you were to go out into your back garden, how many species do you think you could find? How many species of ferns? How many flowers? How many birds? How many worms? How many cockroaches? How many bugs of various kinds? And now imagine 7 billion other humans doing that. And now think about the possibility that there may be other living planets in our galaxy. Some people would say there could be millions of them, each with its own millions of diverse species. Life really is staggeringly creative and diverse.
Okay, so as we start looking at it, life is a pretty amazing and varied thing. And so when we start talking about biodiversity, what we're referring to is the variety of life, its processes, how many different organisms there are, what the genetic differences are that exist among them, and the communities and ecosystems in which these occur. So literally, the word biodiversity means many different kinds, diversity, of life, bio, or the number of species in a particular area. Scientists have identified about 1.9 million species alive today, and we classify them or divide them into 6 kingdoms of life. I'll show you here on the next slide. It's quite a staggering number if you consider that there may be up to 100 million species, and we've only categorized about 1.9 million of them. Now that's on the high end, granted, but you get the idea of how much there may be out there. So here is what we call a cladogram, and we'll talk about this more in your next 6 weeks when we start looking at evolutionary history. But essentially what you're looking at is a breakdown of the different groups of organisms. We break them down into 3 domains: bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. So bacteria and archaea fall into a classification known as prokaryotes. These are those that lack a nucleus and other membrane-bound organelles, and we'll talk more about this probably next week. The other side is eukaryotes, or eukarya. These are the organisms we're more familiar with. This is your plants, your animals, your fungus, and a group called the protists. When we go ahead and start looking at these organisms, we need to make sure that we understand what separates these 2 different groups of organisms. So the prokaryotes are going to be those that do not contain a nucleus or any other membrane-bound organelles. So we might highlight that when we start looking at this. Prokaryotic cells do not contain a nucleus or any other membrane-bound organelles. Okay, this is going to be important vocabulary here. The eukaryotes contain membrane-bound organelles, including a nucleus. So if you see the cell of an organism and it has a nucleus, it must be a eukaryote. If it lacks a nucleus, then it must be a prokaryote. We'll talk about some more variations of this a little bit later, but this gives you a starting point for classifying into the 2 groups. Okay. Now there are 2 types of prokaryotes, bacteria and archaea. They have very separate evolutionary histories, and the archaea actually includes many of what we call the extremophiles that we've been studying to help us understand what life might be like on other planets. These are the organisms that can live in deep sea thermal vents, that can live in geysers and volcanoes, that can withstand incredibly harsh conditions. But whether you're looking at archaea or bacteria, these are both prokaryotes. Okay? All the other organisms that we see on our planet are classified into one group known as the eukaryotes. And these eukaryotes include our fungus, so mushrooms and things like that here, plants, all the grasses, trees, flowers, etc., animals, including you and I, and this small group over here of protists. These are mostly single-celled organisms, pretty small, and we can talk more about those later. Okay. So there are your eukaryotes, protists, microscopic free-living cells all the way up to your giant seaweed. Fungi, consumers that secrete substances to break down food. These are decomposers, if you remember your food categorizations from middle school. Some are single-celled, but most of them are multicellular. If you go in your backyard, you might see some mushrooms right now. Then we get into the plants. I used to teach botany for many years, and I love plants. There's so much that they do for us and for our planet. These are multicellular and mostly photosynthetic. There's a small group of plants that are parasitic, and they have roots, stems, and leaves. And lastly, we get to our animals, which you probably are the most familiar with. This is our pets, our cats, our dogs, us, horses, you name it. Anything that we are used to calling an animal would fall into this category. Okay, now, when we start talking about those numbers of just how many species there are that are identified and how many might still be out there, it's pretty staggering just how much there is. When we go ahead and take a look at the known species of organisms, most of the things that we've identified are actually animals. But those animals actually make up a pretty small fraction of what's on our planet. Okay? And of those animals, most of them actually are classified in the group of invertebrates as well as our vertebrate species that we start talking about in terms of large scale things. There are very few. Most of them are going to be insects. Okay, it's weird to think that most of the species that we've identified that are animals are your bugs, but they are. Okay, and then we start looking at your plant groups, And most of those are flowering plants, but there are a lot of different things, everything from mosses to ferns to cone-bearing trees, etc. Scientists still are discovering new species. Now, that rate may not be as fast as it was in the past, but we still don't know exactly how many species there are. And most estimates range from somewhere from 5 to 30 million species. So think of that. We're almost at 2 million identified. That's not even half of what most scientists think are on our planet, which is pretty impressive. And before you start thinking, wow, there are so many things and there's just so much how we could ever classify it, species don't always stay here. For every new species that's discovered, we also discover one or two that seems to go extinct. As species die out and new ones are developed, biological diversity is constantly changing. Our planet is not something that stays stagnant. Everything's changing, evolving over time. The development of the new species typically will take millions of years, but for some fast reproducing species, this can occur much more rapidly. New species of American flies have developed within the space of about 150 years, but some species formation occurs much more gradually. We start thinking about some of our larger mammal species, for example. But despite all the species there are, we have to realize that of all the species that have ever existed since life began, 99.9% of them are now extinct. You heard that right. 99.9% of all species that have ever lived on our planet are now extinct. So species constantly come and go, but there have also been periods of mass extinction, followed by periods in which new species and new lines of evolutionary descent have flourished. As we continue on with our exploration of life and what life is, I think it's valuable to have a frame of reference that talks about just how much life is out there and how much of that life is already gone. Okay? We are in a new point in time where humans are impacting what happens to those species far more so than any time in our human history or in the history of our planet. We are poised to make a huge impact on what is on our planet. And so it's good to learn about these species and what life is and why it matters so that we can do something to protect it moving forward. Okay? All right, guys. So that's the end of this this presentation. Make sure you go back and highlight key vocabulary, get your main ideas, your paragraphs, and then go ahead and produce your summary for your learning log. All right, guys. Thanks very much. Bye.